Welcome back from break. Once again, we're moving into the second panel on SOF utility. In this panel, Dr. David Ellis, a senior fellow here at JSOU, will moderate the next discussion that seeks to explore the question, what is, in fact, distinct and peculiar about SOF and SOF operations? Dr. Ellis, the floor is yours.
Dr. Long, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here with everyone today. And I have two fantastic panelists with me. I have CW5 Duke Duclos and Colonel John Sannes. Allow me to introduce them very quickly, and then we'll move on to the panel. Chief Warrant Officer 5 Duke Duclos enlisted in the Army in 1985, served in 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and then 1st Special Forces Group. Chief Duclos deployed in support of multiple combat operations, including Panama, Somalia, Philippines, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He later was assigned to JFK SWICS as the Special Forces Doctrine writer, lead responsible for developing numerous publications, including the Army and Joint Unconventional Warfare Doctrine and Special Forces Operations Manual. He earned a PhD in social psychology with a focus on civil resistance and revolution. Chief Duclos is currently assigned to USSOCOM, working on several command initiatives, including advising on the implementation of the Comprehensive Review. Colonel John Sannes began his military career serving as an enlisted soldier with the South Dakota and Minnesota National Guard in 1992, later transitioned over to the Officer Corps and completed the Q course in 2002. Colonel Sannes served in a variety of assignments to include 3rd Special Forces Group, U.S. Army Special Operations Command, 1st Special Forces Group, and 1st Special Forces Command. Colonel Sannes served as the Assistant S3 for the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Special Forces, USSOC G3X, Operations Officer, 1st Group S3, JSOU J3, Afghan National Army, 1st Special Operations Brigade Advisor, the SOJIDF Iraq J3, 1st Special Forces Command G3, and SOJIDF OIR J3. So as you can imagine, we're going to have fantastic experience undergirding this panel today. With that, what I'd like to do is start by asking the first question of the panel and then pass it over to our panelists to get their initial responses, and then we'll move into a Q&A from that. So our first question is, how does SOF's identity promote or prevent strategic effects in the future operating environment? As we all know, corporate identity, organizational identity leads to a number of presumptions about how we should behave and how we should organize. So as we look out to the future operating environment, the core SOF identity may be something we have to amend or adapt for future operations. With that, I'd like to start it off with Chief Duclos and your initial comments and thoughts.
Yeah, Dave, can you hear me okay? Well, first of all, thanks for having me this morning. I'm honored to be able to sit this panel, especially with Colonel Sannes. It's kind of it seems like an old discussion we probably had many times. You know, SOF identity, I think that the challenge in this question is SOF is big, right? This is a spectrum of subcultures and tribes that make up SOF identity. There's a kind of a feeling going around the campfire right now that we're going through an identity crisis in SOF, and I'm not sure if that's true or not. I think the discussion today, we can bring out some of those points about why we're being seen that way. I think identity is how we see ourselves and how others see us, right? And like in many cases, probably the academic answer is it depends. Right? It depends if we're going to have strategic effects to be able to prevent or to shape something in the future. But I think it depends on our ability to evolve. So dinosaurs didn't die off because they weren't the strongest creature, right? They died off because of their inability to evolve. And I think that evolution, as we look through how the environment changes and how the demands on SOF and the needs for SOF change, I think that's going to force that evolution. And we go through this big evolutionary, I mean, we're always evolving, but we go through these big steps in SOF, it seems, about every 20 years. So 20 years ago, you know, 9/11 was a big moment. That was a Cambrian moment where we forced evolutionary change. And I think 20 years before that, if you look back, was probably Desert One And this forced the jointness and the modern SOF of really of not component service SOF, but the modern SOF of where we are. And 20 years before that was Vietnam. And when we evolved past the OSS model of stay behind resistance networks only, and more looked at it in regional and globally, and FID being involved and added into the mix. This is the Kennedy era evolutionary movement. So while these were precipitated or driven by an external event that caused change to happen immediately, I think in this case we're seeing a slower change, and that's why it's coming across, or there's a feeling that there's more of an identity crisis, because it's not an abrupt change that's making it happen like 9/11 moment, right? But we still all see within the force, I think we still all see that this evolution is happening, this change state is happening. With that said, though, I caution that as we look to the future and this evolution, and hopefully we'll get into how, you know, the cores of what makes us unique and the perspectives and the peculiar things about SOF that we should hold on to. The challenge is evolving without getting rid of the things that we do need. It's throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? It's saying, no, we don't need ODA, we need cyber warriors, or we need, you know, so there is a pendulum that swings one way or another where we can compensate and we can go too far. And I think that as long as we identify that there are universal tools that are used no matter what, right, that are universal to everything. And these are the basis of who and what we are, like the saw, the hammer, the screwdriver. They're going to be used. I don't care if I'm building a space station, right, on the moon or something. I'm going to use these same type of tools. The environment might change. We have this unique thing in the Army. We talk about task, condition, and standards. The tasks don't change. It's the conditional variable that changes maybe how we do them or how we use those tools. That's the conditional variable, but it's not the task itself. The task itself is going to stay the same. And I think our tasks may evolve into how we're going to do them in the future. And that shapes her identity, but I don't know that it is going to change who we are at our core, as long as who we are is right, and that's I think the challenge going forward.
Colonel Sanders, your thoughts?
Hey, thanks, Dave. Appreciate you having me on this panel. Duke, always good to see you. And like you said earlier, I think we've kicked this around the campfire a couple of times over the past couple of years. But what I'd like to add is when we talk about the identity crisis, or what I would argue is we have identity challenges, and those identity challenges are based on the missions we are told to execute. So across the RSOF greater regiment, there's a lot of missions. We're all globally, regionally aligned, but there's one thing that is common across every RSOF component. And I think that's important to just reiterate that we are specifically assessed, selected, and trained to execute the core missions and tasks for Army Special Operations. And what I constantly remind in my formation is, for the past 20 years, while we have been heavily involved in the COIN and CT fight in the Middle East, simultaneously, 7th Group has also maintained their FID relationships in the South and Central American AORs, just as 1st Special Forces Group has done the same in the Indo-Pacific region while simultaneously fighting in CENTCOM. And I think it's important for people to come back to those touch points and reflect on that, because one of the things that we see is a lot of our identity is identified by what you see in public spaces and social media spaces, which we often refer to as the bearded man kicking in a door in the Middle East with their partners, where arguably for the past 60 years, Army Special Forces has probably been more involved quietly by, with, and through their partners in the AOR, and less in direct conflict. It's not lost on us what those burdens have been for the last 20 years and those mission sets are. But again, that is just one of the missions that we had to do post 9/11 environment. And I think there's a lot of room for us to get back to our roots and really get into that competitive space prior to conflict, much like we were in before 9/11. I'll give it back to you, sir, or to Duke.
Let me, if I might, expand on that just a second. And Duke, you'll recognize this question from the November event that we did together. Colonel Sanders, we had undertaken a look at the core activities a couple of months ago to analyze whether or not they're valid or not. And one of the things that that popped up out of that conversation was the difference between strategic effect and core activities. And so I wonder if the identity that we currently root in is more around those core activities versus the strategic effect that we need to achieve in the future operating environment. And Duke, let me pass that over to you and get your initial thoughts with that event we did together kind of in the back of your mind.
Yeah, Dave, I think that's I mean, that's the challenge is we identify ourselves in many ways with our attributes, if you will, with the characteristic nature of our force, that with you know, different things that you know songs and tropes and memes and identifiers of our culture become who we are. And I think the point that Colonel Santis brought up earlier about it starts with the mission. This is a story that, and he may have been asked this at the same time, General Beaudet, when he was a first group commander, used to ask people, what makes us special, right? It says special forces on your shoulder. What makes you special? And people would say, well, I'm specially trained. And he would say, hey, LURS does more reconnaissance training than you do. Are they special? Or this chef who bakes this certain, cake at the White House, he's super selected and super trained, but is he special? And the answer ultimately he was looking for was it's the mission. Right? The mission has to be the driver behind all of those other subcultural indicators and things that we value are all there only because there is a need for them, that the nation says, hey, we have this mission that makes us unique. And, apart from that, all of those things are just tangential. And to be honest, they don't have the value without that tie into the why. And so I think we get lost in the sauce when we start falling in love with the how, or we start falling in love with not even the how, but I call it fantasy LARPing about how we think we should be doing business versus starting with the why of the mission. And as long as we use that as the context and the driver for our identity, and it ties into that, then I think that it's the kind of the litmus test. Are we on the right track? It's when we start to say, hey, we are this because that's the way we've always been, or that's the way it was when I went through the course, or that's the way it was when I did whatever, then we're holding on to legacy things that perhaps are not as valuable to the mission as we ever thought they would be, and ever were in reality.
Duke, you just came up with a new article title called SOF as LARPing, and I expect to see that in the near future. Colonel Santis, your thoughts?
If I could jump on where Duke dropped off there is, I think it's, again, for me, it's easy to look back and I look at our foundation of unconventional warriors, and that is what every RSOF service member is trained to a standard. That baseline, that underlying capability applies greatly, and it doesn't matter what domain we're operating in, that being specifically assessed, selected, and trained to execute unconventional warfare allows us to get after every other RSOF core task. Now, the degree of readiness per se per one of those core tasks, that's up to every commander that's in support of a GCC on what missions he or she's been given to execute. So I think a lot of people, we get lost, and there's this greater discussion, do we have a lost identity? I don't think so. Again, I think every TSOC commander right now is in the great power competition space, but how they apply the force to get after great power competition is different based on the region they're in and the authorities they have to execute. What I do believe strongly is that the RSOF team, Special Forces, CA, and PSYOPers, we can all come together and solve those complex problems, or at least give the best potential outcome or opportunity to succeed to the to the TSOC commanders based on those authorities that we have. So again, to me, it always comes back to unconventional warfare is what we were trained to do, and everything around unconventional warfare is really what we are capable of doing, again, depending on your level of readiness and what your focus is at that given time. If I could just add one more comment, I think it's appropriate. When Colonel Egkrute's a good friend of mine, so when we had the identity crisis discussion, we went back and forth quite a bit. And I think it was easy for me to explain as a 7th Group commander that we actually manage multiple identities in 7th Group, because at any given time, we have one battalion going to Afghanistan. They're focused on the COIN CT fight. Simultaneously, we have other elements and battalions focusing on Central and South America that is not COIN or CT, but more on the foreign internal defense, build partner capacity to help our partners get after their CT threats. So it's pretty easy for me to understand our identities, where I sit and what I see, but I would just offer that up to the greater audience that if we continuously come back to our roots, which is unconventional warfare, this actually solves a lot of our problems when challenging the identity. Back to you, sir.
Thank you. And one of the features of this particular panel is there's a heavy USSOC representation. I'm the one person on it who does not have that background. But as a member of this, as an enabler, as part of the SOF environment enterprise for a while, I want to ask a question of, has there been somewhat of a convergence of SOF identity? We talk about this as a thing. You both have brought out the subcultures and identities that go along with the components. So my question is, has there been a bit of a convergence of a SOF identity over the past 15 years? And if so, has that made the force somewhat fungible, meaning we can take one from one place and just put it in another based on the mission? Is this appropriate? If so, if not, what do you think is the resilience of those subculture identities? Duke?
So, yeah, if you look at like evolutionary science, right, it's funny. A dog is evolved from a bear, right? It's evolved from a bear. The canines evolved from the bear. And you may remember me telling this before. A Tasmanian tiger, if you will, which is extinct now, looks like a dog. It looks just like a dog, but it was evolved as a marsupial. It wasn't evolved from the bear, but they both evolved to look almost identical in every way. And the reason is because the evolutionary drivers were the same that made them evolve to that point. Right. So if given completely separate services, have no connection with each other, we're in a vacuum, two different services, and you gave them the same set of challenges, they would ultimately evolve to look the same. I think that the reason that we're seeing that we've lost some of our branch or organizational uniqueness and specificity, if you will, our lanes, our swim lanes, whatever you want to call it, is because the problem set we were thrown into drives that evolution to an answer, and we evolved to meet that answer. In many ways, we ended up looking the same because the problem of Afghanistan or of CENTCOM kind of drove that unique answer. And I would say in the past or in another environment, it would drive a different selection to make the end result look differently. So yes, while our identities have kind of merged because the problem set in the environment was the driver of those, I think that as we break back out into regional SOF and to different problem sets that we face across, across the spectrum of the competition, I think that we're going to see the evolutionary drivers will then change those identities back to be the required of what they're required to be. I think it ultimately, like Colonel Sanders said, it's the mission, specifically UW, and I 100%, I'm in total agreement that UW is the driver of what makes us special, at least in the RSOF side of the house, or at least in the SF side of the house, right? But I think that the environment's going to force that. And if there was a time where, let's say, something very peculiar like language, right? That's very unique that we always claim, hey, we have this language. If there was a technology advancement that gave me the language implant and no longer, and language was no longer needed to be able to perform the mission, it was no longer tied to the why or the mission requirement, then that particular skill would atrophy. And I mean, we're not riding around in horse and carriage anymore. With that said, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I mean, there's a thing called GPS, but we still teach map and compass, right? We have vehicles, but we still road march. So I think that there is an analog requirement and a skill set and a mentality that comes with the training of the analog that jumping to the latest tech revolution doesn't always make sense. So I think we can go too far too fast and go down the tech road and replace the old school skills. But I think that both bring something that to the mission. I think as long as we stay focused, again, as I said earlier, as long as we stay focused on the mission and how it relates to the environment, then the culture and identity will shape itself in tune to that.
Thanks, Duke. Colonel.
Hey, Duke, I think I can add to that. I think where a lot of people see the identities kind of blending, if I'm getting this right from the original question, where they see the identities blending is really the fact that we've come together in the last 20 years by effectively operating as a cross-functional team. So I think we quickly, some people might look from an outside view in and say, hey, all our SOF is the same. The reality is it absolutely isn't. Those O3-led unit of actions across the SF, CA, and PSYOP have wildly different missions and capabilities. But what's unique and what I think has changed in my short time in SF for almost the last 20 years is our ability to come together as a cross-functional team. So it doesn't matter what region of the world in 2021, you're either able to put an SF individual, a CA, or a PSYOPer all in the same room to solve a problem and to give a viable solution back to the TSOC Joint Force Commander to achieve an effect. And I think that's really what the difference is, that people are kind of confusing that all the identities have blended together. No, they haven't. What's really happened is we work together very well now as a cross-functional team. And that was one of the great byproducts of the post 9/11 environment. Our ability for SF, CA, and PSYOPs to share the same battle space and to come together to give better solutions for problem sets, it has probably never been better. So I would just offer that it's, again, more of a cross-functional team identity for our SOF writ large is how it's working right now. Back to you, sir.
So building on that conversation, the next question is, what is distinct and peculiar about SOF or SOF operations in the future operating environment? So as we're projecting out and looking at an identity moving forward, what is it about how SOF should operate in the future operating environment that we would need to explore, both at that macro level and then at the subculture level?
Yeah, so I think these are two questions and separate questions that are very distinct, right? So, one speaks to the who SOF is, right? What's peculiar about SOF? And that's organizational, that's cultural, and the other one is SOF operations. Now, these should be linked. And what we said earlier was that obviously one should be the driver of the other, because there are things that could be peculiar about SOF or unique about SOF that are delinked from that mission or that requirement. For instance, if everyone in SOF had a unique tattoo, okay, well, that's peculiar and that's unique to SOF, but I don't know that it's relevant, or I don't know that it's, it's correlation, but I don't know that it's truly causation based on the mission being the driver of that. Does that make sense? So I think that we have to be very clear that these are two distinct things, because they can be desynced. They can be delinked. Unfortunately, when we're talking about the SOF operations, are we talking about operations of the past, the current, or the future? And if we're talking about, evolution is slow to change. It truly is. Without that big change Cambria event, then perhaps there are still people holding on to old things, old drivers that drive the mission that are no longer relevant to the current mission or the future mission, and that's driving the identity, right? So that uniqueness of the organization is framed based on that the environment and the mission, but some of those may be kind of outdated and in that process of being evolved out, right? So, for instance, when I got in the Army in the 80s, putting camouflage on your face was part of our, that was part of the mission. You cammied your face up, and who cares if you're, but this is a carryover from like the Vietnam era, where you're doing small unit patrolling in a jungle. You're not riding in a vehicle or getting off a helicopter. You're very much blending into the environment. And we see that carry over today, and the fact that even though we're in urban environments, we still wear camouflage, and we still, we have some carryovers that are indicators of that past culture, right? That are still in our culture. But I think as we go forward, if we don't kind of look at those and say, hey, what are the indicators that we're evolving correctly to the future and that we're unique because of the mission driver in the future, and find that parallel ground. And that's a long way of preamble to saying, basically, the thing that I think is unique about our operations, which should make us unique about our culture and our who and our organization, is the concept of operations in denied area. Now, I've talked about this before. Denied areas is the why, in my opinion, of unconventional warfare. I used to think the why was coerce, disrupt, overthrow. right? So 2009, we redefined unconventional warfare. It's 34 words long. And I always thought that the why of it was course, disrupt, or overthrow. But that's kind of all warfare. All warfare is to course, disrupt, or overthrow, right? Really the why of why we need a surrogate capability or why we need a partner force, why we need to operate through or with is because the area is denied. If it wasn't denied, we could operate there unilaterally. Right. So the why really became the denied area. And I think if we look at the context of denied area to mean not just physical denial, but also politically denied area. Right. And the joint definition 305 gives of denied areas an area where our current capabilities, you can't, limit operations there. You can't operate there successfully with the operational constraints and force capabilities. But if we look at SOF at large, not just RSOF and the special warfare capability, but SOF at large, really all of it has evolved because of the denied area, right? Even our strike capability has to be better, has to, have better support, has to, have these capabilities that are hyper conventional, if you will. They're the same as a conventional force, but better because that area would not be accessible to a conventional force. Right. And then on the special warfare side, indigenous approach, we have to have a partner capability because politically that area is denied for us to send in troops to operate, conventional troops to operate unilaterally. So I think the unique thing about SOF at large, I'm talking about joint SOF, is that in one way, shape, or form, all SOF has evolved to meet a gap that the conventional forces do not have. And that gap in capabilities could be answered either by finding people who can work through that gap, that's the through and with model, or by becoming hyper elite, right? Better, faster, stronger, more intelligence, better synchronization, all of these things to bypass that barrier of denied area. And I think that that's the commonality of SOF at the joint level where, of course at SOCOM, I'm looking at that now at the joint level of all SOF, why, because I could easily talk to the why of special forces because the through and with the indigenous approach that there's no one else that does that. That's very unique. But how does that apply to AVSOC or to, how does that apply? Why do we need, are they just, the same exactly as the other pilots, but they do it better or that, no. And the reason why is because of that denied area, that denied space. That's what makes it unique, in my opinion.
Colonel, your thoughts?
Hey, Duke, I'm going to try and jump on there. You brought up that unique gap, and I think that's specifically across the joint force. You can say that is why we are selected, trained, manned, and equipped to get after that gap, whether it's the by, with, and through approach, or it's working in the denied areas. It's in those spaces where our conventional force teammates cannot operate persistently. And I think that's important to note. So as we look at some of the different training environments we have, right now, the last probably 4 or 5 years, there's been a pretty heavy push to ensure for our SOF that we continuously invest in the JNTCs, the NTCs, the JRTCs. So we have that SOF, CF, integration, interoperability, working well together. Simultaneously, First Special Forces Command is looking to stand up the SOF Training Center, commonly known as Fort Bliss, where we used to do all of our PMTs, but that we look to that as the future of an environment where we can employ the SOF force against those threats to, again, try and see if our training, manning, and equipping is right before we put it into the operational environment. So what I'm trying to say, it always comes back to is, big fan of, our bread and butter. We come from the unconventional warfare background, but the training, manning, and equipping to ensure that we can operate in these spaces and then test those spaces, whether that's using the JNTCs to work with our CF teammates or the future SOF Training Center, where we're going to see what the future holds and how we can work in that environment. I think we'll really test to what our unique capabilities are, and it'll present, again, to the Joint Force Commanders opportunities to employ the forces in the AOR. So, kind of around back to what is distinct and peculiar about SOF and SOF operations, to me, it comes back to that specially selected, trained, manned, and equipped, and that we can rapidly modernize or innovate to get through a problem set and move on to the next objective. Back to you, sir.
So as I listen to the conversation, it appears, or at least I'm interpreting your comments, hopefully correctly, as coming down a little bit more on the SOF as different than the SOF as elite. And perhaps I'm misinterpreting, but One of my questions, and that is essentially the third question, but I want to probe on that just a little bit in the conversation. Is there necessarily a different, do we have to have one or the other? Or is it possible to say that we need a little bit of both, depending on the subculture or the mission, the specific mission? So here I'm thinking the difference between, say, civil affairs is different from conventional forces versus 75th Ranger as an element of SOF that really is hyper elite or hyper conventional elite. So what are your thoughts on that, Duke?
Yeah, I think you answered it. I think both, right? This is a false dichotomy. I think that we argue elite versus special are different. This is Tucker and Lamb's discussion in their special operations book. I think for our SOF, it's a different discussion specifically, or within SF regiment, it's a different discussion. But as it expands and we look at AVSOC, or we look at the Ranger Regiment, or we look at other people, I don't think elite is a bad discussion. If the way through that, again, for me, the denied area is not physically denied, right? It's also politically denied. It's culturally denied. It's denied, linguistically. It could be racially denied. Whatever the reason you can't operate there needs a different capability. So for me, there are many ways to get through that barrier of denial. The approach that we've taken on is the indirect approach, through and with, and that works. We can get through the denial by finding someone else who can operate there when we can't. That's a great through approach. But another way to do that is increase your capability and become hyper elite, where you can do the things that the infantry can do, but you can do it at such a level that you can penetrate that denied space through a higher technical ability, right? And that could be in the air. They have special, unique technical capabilities that they could fly into that area where the conventional aviators could not. Therefore, they're getting through the penetrating the barrier of denial. Or maybe it's just a small discrete team that politically is acceptable to operate in an area where politically a large formation would not be able to operate. So they're getting through the barrier of denial by the size of the element themselves. So I think there are many ways to get through the denied space. I think we could limit ourselves and say the only way is being different. But there may be a way just saying being better in some cases, or being smaller, or being faster, or being right. So that I think we can limit ourselves into this false dichotomy and saying different is a way that SOF is. But I think the hyper elite model works as well, and it's been proven to work because I think traditionally, if you look at special operations in historically, these elite formations, these commando or elite formations, could go deeper behind enemy lines, or could go into places, politically that the conventional forces could not go. So I think that model, by framing it around the denied area, that there are many ways to get through that denied space, to me allows for both different and elite.
Duke, I'm really glad you clarified on the definition of denied. That was causing me a little bit of angst as well.
Yeah, and just so we're clear, that's the problem is we keep associating denied with a physical denied space, like behind enemy lines. And so we say things like to me, the reason we do through and with is because denied area. I mean, the UW definition says that in a denied area. It's not talking about something that's physically denied. It could be politically denied. I mean, look at North Korea. Even if I had all the authorities, permissions, and access into North Korea, genetically, I cannot operate in that area. So I need to find a partner who can, right? And so there's a huge difference between a with partner and a through partner. People use those terms. First of all, they say by, with, and through. There is no three modalities, right? That's a myth. There's two modalities, and it's just with and through. The by was a carryover from a phrasing of the language, which said by operating through and with, right? So there's no by modality. There's just with and through. With adds capacity. With is a force multiplier, right? And for with partners, I need partners who operate like I do. It's the I3. I need interdependence, interoperability, integration. They need to be on the same comm systems, the same weapon systems. Ideally, we need to be able to integrate and operate. That's the with partner, and he gives me with. With gives me with, right? And capacity. The through partner gives me depth, right? And that's capability. And I'm operating through him. And so a through partner has something that I don't have, right? They fill the gaps that I don't have. They don't operate like me. They operate in an area where I cannot operate. And so I'm operating through them to get to that point, to the X. And so these are a distinction that we don't always clearly make. We say things like by, through, with, and we don't make that clear distinction that the through partner gives me more depth, and that's what's going to penetrate into, in many cases, that's what's going to penetrate into that denied area. In that model, the hyper conventional, hyper elite, it does it as well. And so I think there are many ways to get through that the barrier of denial, depending on how we define denial. And I think both models work.
Thanks. Hey, Colonel, I wanted to flip back again on the elite versus different, and then take it to any other comments you had building off of Chief.
Yeah, Duke, that's a tough one to follow up with there. And thanks again for the class on the by, with, and through. I myself agree that it's always with and through, and the by was for the byproduct. Yeah, and I can thank Paul Tompkins for tuning me up on that probably 15 years ago. But what I would like to offer is, when we talk about both the different versus elite, I'd say it's both. Yes, we are different because we are very human-centric. We are focused on the with and through of partner forces. That's what makes our mission unique more than anybody else's. And I think on the elite side, that's where, as a commander, I look more towards the readiness. So I try and remind other senior leaders and decision makers, while every special forces group has about 2,600 people in their formation, what we are not is, we're not platform centric, we are human centric. So to maintain what SOCOM would call on the ready, a 1, 3, and 18, a SOTF, 3 AOBs, 18 ODAs, to maintain that level of elite readiness, we think we have it right now and going in the future, that I can maintain one battalion ready 24/7, 365 at the highest levels of readiness. After that one battalion, you start assuming levels of risk based on how, kind of elite or how ready you want to maintain that battalion. So what I would offer to the wider audience is different and elite, yes to both on that question. But really what it comes down to is, how well can you maintain that highest level of readiness across your organization? And I think, we'd be kidding ourselves. Nobody expects the Air Force to have a 100% OR rate on every one of their platforms in a wing. We shouldn't expect the same out of a human formation. So to maintain that level of eliteness, it's going to go through a readiness model. And at certain points in time, you're going to have the highest level of readiness. And then at other times, you may have to assume risk based on where that formation's at in their readiness model. But I think we could help maybe change the dialogue a little bit, that yes, they are different, we are different, and there is a level of elitism, but it's maintained at a level of readiness, because that's what we're really getting down to, is commander's risk on readiness.
And part of the reason that I tried to take this pathway into conversations, we had a question from the audience on the larger SOF identity. And it reads, we possess multiple identities at all times. Also, these identities are co-constructed. I think we are getting close to what an identity is and what it does. What is the real issue with identity? So if we're looking at relative identity relative to what, Duke, kind of going back to your initial point, is there a soft meta identity that comfortably allows for these lower sub-identities to be mission oriented and still achieve a larger effect? So Duke?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the crisis or the issue is when there's a desynchronization of your identity and your culture with your mission and purpose, right? If you find yourself going down this road where they don't match up, then there's an issue, and issues can happen, that the force operates in a way that they believe that they should be operating in, and what the nation is asking them to do or be is something completely different, right? So I think that desynchronization is probably what we would call a crisis or an issue. But I think that those evolutionary drivers are going to drive it. And I think the leadership, I have faith in the leadership within our ranks. I think we have the best leaders, obviously within SOCOM. I think our guys are fantastic and amazing, and they've evolved to become very, very smart and independent and bottom-up driven. So they're going to see the value. If they don't see the value of what we do, there's a self-correction that's going to happen. But I think that underlying substrata, or that meta identity, as long as we educate, or we make sure that everyone knows that that's based on the mission, and that mission, in my opinion, again, I go back to that uniqueness across SOF, which is very hard to find across the full spectrum of SOF in the joint world is that denied area, the ability to penetrate that denied area. And so I think, to me, we can do something for the nation that no one else can do. And that's speaking to denied area, right? They can't do it. If they could do it, then it wouldn't be denied. And so, saying that, it's easy to say that, like, we offer something that no one else can do. Well, that's easy to say without that mental construct of denied space, which then makes it easier to understand and say, look, they cannot operate. If they can, and that's the litmus test. If someone else can operate there and do that same mission, then it's not SOF appropriate because we're not really required. And I think that the meta identity, or that substrata that should cross the culture of all the organizations, is that we are something different. We're unique, and that uniqueness is driven by how we go about getting to that denied area.
Colonel.
Yeah, I think Duke nails it. Being able to work in that denied environment is exactly who the SOF operators. That's who we are. That's what we're trained, manned, and equipped to do. And because this question comes up quite a bit about the identity crisis. What I come back to often is, CT and COIN are only 2 of the overall 12 RSOF core tasks. So if we can take those 2 and recognize them for what they were for the past 20 years, if that's what our nation's called upon us to do more than anything else, but quickly be reminded that on September 10th, 2001, we were not CT and COIN focused. And we were a very ready force that Joint Force commanders can employ right after 9/11. And that is what we owe back to our future commanders. That's what we owe in the future, is to maintain that level of readiness, that while we have 12 RSOF core tasks, the CT and the COIN are only 2 of those 12. And what we need to do is make sure that we are capable to execute all of those missions and operations appropriately in our readiness model to be ready for the next crisis. So to me, I can, again, walk it always back to what our RSOF core tasks are, what our missions are, what our GCCs are asking us to do time now. And then we have a training readiness model that gets us there. But that's how I kind of approach that question. Back to you guys.
Thank you. We had another question that starts, I agree that mission is what drives evolution. What future missions must SOF prepare for to evolve from the identity we have now to the identity we need, all capitals, need to have? So looking at what is that effect? And Duke, I did want to press a little bit on the denied environment concept, because I can, and you started to, I think, qualify it with the different kinds of denial. But I can imagine an environment where SOF in the future, its benefit to the military overall is in the political effect it's able to achieve as having local sensitivities, relationships on the ground, and enduring trust that don't require denied environment per se. So I thought I'd press a little bit on that. And what are your responses or thoughts on that component? And what do we have in our identity now that is easily adaptable to that, or perhaps resistant?
So I think it's the same question if I reframe it. I think that the future missions, obviously the first pivot that we're seeing on the horizon, I'm not talking about like Space Force, this SOF on Mars. Immediately we're seeing this competition, right, is the next ridgeline that everyone sees. I think we've all agreed on that. We can call it great power competition, or we just call it strategic competition. However we frame that, I think that there's an understanding that the new status quo or steady state of operations below that threshold of conflict, right, is kind of where we need to be tailored and fit to operate within. But I think that your second part of that question, is there a non-denied space, right, that SOF should be focusing on? I think that the competition space is very denied, right? Because if I could just send in, 82nd Airborne to go, into a country X and, shoot up, Chinese or our competitor, it's not going to happen. There's red lines and there's thresholds of armed conflict that the conventional or the general purpose force operate well within. If it goes to that level, that is their game. But I think it's that our opponent in the competition game is meeting military and strategic objectives without breaking over that threshold of violence, that is the challenge to the nation, that we're losing the game because we don't realize we're in the game. And we haven't oriented ourselves to that in that Boyd's Law OODA loop, right? We're still thinking, hey, this is peacetime, and we're not seeing that there are competition activities below that threshold of violence. And so I think that while that is, in my opinion, it's not what SOF does, it's when SOF does it. And it's in that status quo, that steady state, that gray zone, phase zero, whatever you want to call this new competition state environment. It's very much denied, though. To say that that's not denied doesn't look at the political deniability and the things that are denying us from using GPC in those areas for those activities. And I think, again, SOF is ideally suited for that. The level of maturity, the small teams, the ability to operate independently with little or no guide, the things that make SOF successful historically are the same things that make SOF the force of choice for this competition zone, steady state activities. It really does. So I think that, if you were saying physical denied, like operating, in a third party neutral country is not physically denied, I agree. I can get on, Delta Airlines and get my frequent flyer miles and fly over there. I mean, COVID might deny it, but other than that, but I think that it's political. It's more denied now. I mean, people always say that like the combats at like Afghanistan, Iraq, they're the hardest environments that we face. I would disagree. I think there's definitely the most, risk of physical, harm that'll come in the DTAC, but the ODTAC, when you look at the environment, the competition phase, there are far more restrictions where you have to, you're learning to run with ankle weights on, with one hand tied behind your back, and still being asked to compete against an opponent who really doesn't have those limitations against them, and they're operating unfettered and just dropping bags of money and cash, and we're still, hey, why are we not competing with these guys? So I think that there's a different level of difficulty, but it's no less denied. If any way, it's more denied than combat zone type of mentality.
Colonel, any comments?
Yeah, Duke, if I could add into that, the denied areas, that also goes back to, I think you remember probably roughly about 12 years ago right now, Duke, we would have the discussions of what does persistent engagement look like in our assigned areas of responsibility. And I think maybe that's what we're struggling with more now in this competition space and denied areas. 12 years ago, we were, kind of burning the formation on both ends, below 1-to-1 deployment to dwell time, and we were persistently engaged across our AORs. And now we have to be a little bit more creative with our engagement strategies to get into these denied spaces, into these denied areas, while still maintaining a healthy, what we now know is a healthy deployment to dwell ratio. So I would argue that, again, denied areas, absolutely, those are the spaces we're going to work in, whether that's physical or the political environment. But I would also argue the one thing that we will continue to get better on is working in the cyber environments, whether that's offense or defense. All things cyber, I think we continue to grow exponentially every day in that environment, but it's not as baked in as conducting a raid, ambush, DA type mission set like we would all naturally think occurs on every detachment. So I think a little bit of both. So getting into those denied areas, denied spaces, how do we do that in the future with more of a persistent engagement, maybe not with the same individuals, but with the same rotating units of action? And then how do we really increase our game in the cyber environment will be the way of the future.
Thank you, Colonel, for tackling one of the other questions I was about to bring up on cyber. So check that one off the block. Thank you very much. We had one that's perhaps tongue-in-cheek, possibly completely serious. How do we deal with denied environments within our own organization? In other words, how do we deal with differences in the J structure, bridging leaders and activities?
I'm going to pass on that one. No, I obviously I'm not a human resources expert in any way. My doctrine was based on operational doctrine, but I think that I default to our earlier discussion that as long as we keep mission focused, everything else kind of comes into play, right? We get lost in the sauce, you know, and armies traditionally, historically, when you know, your shining boots and parade uniforms matter more than how you fight, then I think you start to have all these little challenges, right? This is kind of first world problems. I think that if you have a mission and you're very focused on what you do for the nation and it's valuable, then everything else kind of falls into play. I mean, we value our partners, let's say the tribes in PSYOP and Civil Affairs and SF and RSOF. We value each other because we've seen the requirement and the necessity and what each tribe brings to the table, right? There's a value in that. And so there's a respect professionally for those things because they all have value. If they didn't, evolution would get rid of them, right? And they would fall off. And so I think this even tackles some of the questions we're having on diversity, inclusion, and these other things, these other issues that we're having culturally within the organization. Once it's tied to the mission and it's tied to who we are and what the reason we need these things, then it becomes evident that it's not just a requirement because it's politically correct or because it's the flavor of the day. It's just something that we have to have in the organization because the mission demands of it. That diversity of thought, diversity of everything, right? So we have to. I think once everything is tied to mission, all of those problems internally to the organizational culture and structure, they get panned out.
And Colonel, I have one last question I'd like to pose to you. As the branches push hard to replicate MDO in synthetic training environments, how do you visualize SOF identity in the execution of those sims? Is it possible? Can it be effective, or to what degree? What happens when Big Army presses a SOF AI?
That's a great question. So having been a part of some of the warfighter exercises and some other simulation exercises in the past, there's absolutely, to answer your question, there's absolutely a place for SOF. I think we still have some work to do on how do we write those scenarios so that you can get a little bit more depth in the exercise of those scenarios. So I think that's probably our challenge right now, is just having enough depth in a scenario that we can use the full array of RSOF or even the joint SOF force to apply to those cyber scenarios. So yes, there is a space for us there. And number two, I think, again, the future will be is further developing those scenarios out so that when we come to participate in these synthetic exercises, you don't run through the exercise in 24 hours or less. That might have happened in previous. I know Duke's laughing because we've both been a part of an exercise where, you know, you kind of finish the thing a little too early. And that's really the challenge.
Gentlemen, we're out of time. Any last thoughts? This is your chance. Duke, first you.
No, just thank you again for allowing me to be part of the conversation. I'm sure I didn't add much other than just goofy analogies, and but you know, I think this is important. This is the same conversation that's going on everywhere, right? Probably from the team room up to the top. I think that Colonel Santos' point earlier of, you know, I don't know that this is a crisis in identity, or if it's just, hey, this is the way that identities and cultures evolve, right? We're not seeing it as abruptly as we did, like 9/11 switch, you know, but we were ready. I mean, even with that abrupt event, that external, you know, meteor hits the planet, dinosaurs dead type event, SOF answered the call immediately. SOF was able to adapt, and I think that says something for our baseline structure, that we have this, you know, we have something right in our cultural, you know, framework that allows us to adapt instantly. I think because this is a slow change, it feels like we are not changing fast enough, but I think that we are. I think that I would argue, if you look over time, and you know, I look at the CR implementation for here at SOCOM, we're doing our we're 1 year. April will be our 1 year release from the CR report. And I think that the implementation, and this is bottom up, this is what the components are doing. This isn't top down, right? This isn't SOCOM saying you will do XYZ. This is self-corrected. Many of the problems that were found in the CR are self-correcting by the force, and they were already ahead of those corrections when even the CR was done. So I think that that evolution process is happening. It's always happening. It's just perceptively slower because there isn't this mark in time event like Desert One or like 9/11, right? And I think that SOF will continue to evolve because we do have the right people that are adaptive and innovative and mentally flexible. And I think that that's the key is we've got this group of great guys and gals, these out of the box thinkers who are very adaptive and flexible and said, okay, how do we solve these problems? And as long as we define the right problems as the, what we're facing in the future, then I think the answers we're going to come up with are probably going to be spot on.
Thank you very much. Colonel Sanders, your parting thoughts.
Hey, Duke, I'll just add to that. I think, our unconventional warfare background, I think, helps us immensely in these spaces. And as long as we continue to assess, select, and train the right individuals to come into our organization, we'll be in a good space going forward. And I think that resonates not just here in the tactical SF groups. And when I talk to my counterparts at SWIC, as I often share with General Roberson, I have zero issues with what SWIC produces at the staff sergeant, 03, and W01 levels. Every one of them that comes to the organization, they're ready to execute the missions that we have tasked currently. So I think that's important to just kind of maintain that focus, not lose sight of that, as well as there's no shortage of missions in this, whether it's a great power competition. I would argue that we've been doing GPC well before 9/11. We are always in a competitive space. It's just how are we going to do that in the competitive spaces in the future going forward? That'll be some of the challenge to say, but at the end of the day, there's no shortage of work. There's plenty of work for everybody in the SOF formation. And I thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel today. And as always, Duke, great to see you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today and great insights. Joe, back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ellis and panel members. That was a fascinating discussion that will no doubt frame the way we think about each of the remaining panels. We will now break for lunch before we resume with the first panel of the SOF Ethics Lens. See you all after lunch.